The morning Alec Dorsey signed the divorce papers, he didn't say a word. He sat across from his wife's lawyers in a glass-walled boardroom on the 14th floor of a downtown Vancouver office building. With the kind of view that makes you feel very small, and he read every line of every page the way a man reads something he already knows by heart. Then he picked up the pen, a cheap ballpoint, not even his, and he signed his name in the places marked with yellow tabs, and he set the pen down and he stood up. Sandra's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Whitfield, who wore a watch that probably cost more than Alec's truck, leaned forward. "You understand what you're giving up here, Mr. Dorsey." It wasn't a question. It was the kind of thing people say when they want you to feel stupid. Alec buttoned his jacket. "I understand everything." He walked out. In the elevator going down, he looked at his reflection in the polished steel doors. 41 years old. Dark circles under his eyes from 2 years of not sleeping well. A face that had learned to stay very still. He pressed the lobby button and watched himself disappear as the doors slid shut. The thing about Alec Dorsey was that nobody who knew him then would have said he was someone who would amount to much. That wasn't cruelty. It was just the math of the situation. He'd grown up in Kamloops, the second of 3 kids, father a drywaller, mother a school secretary. He'd been good at computers in the way quiet boys sometimes are, not flashy, just persistent. He'd gone to BCIT instead of UBC because the tuition was lower. He'd gotten a job doing back-end systems work for a mid-sized logistics company in Burnaby, and he'd been good at that too in the same quiet way. He'd met Sandra at a friend's wedding in the Okanagan when he was 32. She was beautiful in the way that makes you think you've been lucky. Tall, confident, the kind of person who walks into a room and the room rearranges itself around her. She laughed easily. She had opinions about wine. She worked in commercial real estate and was very good at it. They got married 14 months later. Her family threw the reception. It was at a vineyard. There were string lights and a 4-piece band. Alec's son was born 2 years into the marriage. They named him Oliver. Wait, no, they named him Owen. No, let's be precise here because precision matters in this story. They named him Cade. 4 letters, simple. The boy had Sandra's eyes and Alec's stubbornness, which is maybe why things turned out the way they did. Cade was 3 years old the first time Sandra told Alec she thought they'd made a mistake. She didn't mean Cade. She meant each other. The years that followed had a particular texture to them, the texture of a house that's slowly losing heat. They were polite. They were careful. They went to a couples counselor named Dr. Ing on Tuesday evenings and sat in adjacent chairs and said careful things about their feelings. Sandra started working longer hours. Alec started picking Cade up from daycare every day because there wasn't anyone else to do it. He'd sit with the boy at the kitchen table and help him with puzzles, or read to him, or just let him drag his toy trucks across the floor while Alec worked on his laptop. That was the other thing about Alec. While he was doing his regular job, the back-end systems work, the logistics software, he was also building something else. He'd been building it for 3 years by the time the marriage finally ended. A small piece of routing software that he'd designed to solve a problem he kept running into at work. He hadn't told Sandra about it because he hadn't thought it would matter. He hadn't told anyone, really, because he was a man who'd learned not to talk about things until they were real. The night before he signed the divorce papers, he sat in Cade's room after the boy had fallen asleep. Cade was 5 years old. He had one of those kids' nightlights that projected little stars onto the ceiling, blue and green, slowly rotating. Alec sat in the chair beside the bed and watched the stars drift across the ceiling and listened to his son breathe. "Dad?" Cade said. He wasn't asleep yet. "Yeah, bud, are you still going to live with us?" Alec looked at his son's face in the blue light. "I'm going to be wherever you are," he said. "That's the deal. Wherever you go, I go." Cade thought about this for a moment. "Even when I'm big? Especially when you're big." The boy seemed to find this acceptable. He closed his eyes again. Alec sat there for another hour, watching the stars rotate. Sandra's legal team had put together an arrangement that, on paper, looked reasonable. Joint custody, but primary residency with Sandra. Alec would get Cade every other weekend and 1 evening a week. The house, which was in Sandra's name from before the marriage, stayed with Sandra. The savings account, which they'd built together over 9 years, was split down the middle, technically. But after accounting for various expenses and debts that Alec hadn't been entirely aware of, his share came out to something modest. He was allowed to keep his truck, his tools, and whatever was in his home office. He could have fought it. His own lawyer, a tired-looking woman named Prakash, who worked out of a small office in New Westminster, told him he should fight it. She said he had grounds. She said the custody arrangement was skewed. She said if they pushed, they could get 50-50 minimum, maybe more given his documented involvement in Cade's daily care. Alec listened to all of this. He sat in her small office with the filing cabinets and the potted plant that was almost dead, and he listened, and then he said, "I'll sign what they've put together." Prakash stared at him. "Mr. Dorsey, that's not— I need you to do one thing for me," he said. "I want to file for a review hearing in 6 months. Just put it in the calendar. Don't explain it. Just file it." She looked at him for a long time. "You know something I don't." "I know some things," he said. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in East Vancouver. It was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled faintly of other people's cooking, which he didn't mind. He set up his home office in the corner of the living room. 2 monitors, a standing desk he'd had since university, a good chair he'd bought with the last of his discretionary money. He put up a small shelf near the front door where he kept a framed photo of Cade and a toy truck that his son had given him. "So you remember me," Cade had said when he pressed it into Alec's hand on moving day. He was 5 years old, and he said it completely seriously, like he was worried it was possible to forget. Alec put the truck on the shelf and looked at it every morning when he left for work. He spent his evenings on the software. He worked with the focus of a man who doesn't have anything else to distract him, which he didn't. He ate simple food. He slept poorly, but he slept. He picked up Cade on the prescribed schedule, and they went to the aquarium and the science museum and the park, and sometimes just sat on the floor of the apartment and did puzzles. And Cade seemed fine, the way children are sometimes fine in the middle of situations that are not fine, which is its own kind of heartbreak. The 6-month review hearing had been filed and scheduled, and that was when Sandra's team moved. What happened next was the kind of thing that people talk about when they talk about how the legal system can be weaponized. It began with a letter from Whitfield's office, the sharp-faced lawyer, requesting that the court order a psychological evaluation of Alec before the review hearing. The stated concern was instability of living situation and questions regarding emotional fitness for primary caregiving responsibilities. Alec read the letter 3 times sitting at his kitchen table. Then he called Prakash. "This is a delaying tactic," she told him. "They want to push the review. They're hoping you'll refuse the evaluation and give them grounds to question you, or you'll take it and they'll find something to use, or the whole thing will get pushed back far enough that the current arrangement becomes the default." Can they actually do this? They can request it. It's not automatic, but judges don't love refusing mental health evaluations when children are involved. It puts them in a difficult position. She paused. "Alec, I need to know, is there anything in your past that would give them material to work with?" There wasn't. He'd never been arrested. He'd never been treated for anything. He drank occasionally and moderately. He had references from Cade's teachers and daycare workers who would say exactly what was true. That he was a consistent, present, capable father. But Prakash was right that none of that mattered entirely. What mattered was the appearance of the thing. And a man living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in East Vancouver, having signed away almost everything without a fight, working some kind of job in logistics, he could be made to look like very little. That was what Sandra's team was counting on. The evaluation was assigned to a Dr. Adichie, a clinical psychologist who worked with the court system and had an office in Kitsilano. Alec went to 4 sessions. He was careful, to be honest, because he'd discovered early in life that honesty is less complicated to maintain than its alternatives. Dr. Adichie was a precise woman who asked very specific questions and wrote things down in a small notebook and gave nothing away. At the end of the 4th session, she said, Mr. Dorsey, I have to ask you something directly. Okay. In our conversations, you've described your current situation in fairly minimal terms. Apartment, job, routine. But you seem, and this is a clinical observation, you seem remarkably unbothered by the financial disparity between your circumstances and your ex-wife's. Can you tell me about that? Alec looked at her for a moment. I'm not unbothered by it, he said. I'm just not worried about it. Is there a difference? Yes, he said. Unbothered means you don't care. Not worried means you know something that makes worry unnecessary. She wrote that down. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, specifically, in a glass tower in Yaletown that housed the Canadian headquarters of a logistics technology company called MoveStream, something was happening that Sandra's lawyers did not know about. 3 years earlier, Alec had built a piece of routing software as a side project. He'd called it, privately, Route Logic. Though the internal working name had been less elegant, the software did something that existing tools did poorly. It optimized multi-point delivery routing in real time by factoring in variables that most systems treated as static. Weather delays, driver fatigue patterns, loading dock availability. It wasn't magic. It was careful, methodical work built over hundreds of evenings at his standing desk. But in the world of logistics, where margins are thin and delays are expensive, it was the kind of careful, methodical work that people would pay very seriously for. He had quietly taken it to market 8 weeks before he signed the divorce papers. He had not mentioned this to Sandra, or to Whitfield, or to anyone except his accountant, a quiet man named Bergeron, who worked out of a strip mall in Coquitlam, and who had spent the better part of the last year helping Alex structure what was about to happen in the most legally unimpeachable way possible. The software had been built entirely on Alex's own time, on his own equipment, using no resources from his employer. It was his. It had always been his. MoveStream had made an initial offer 6 weeks before the divorce was finalized. Alec had thanked them and asked for time. His accountant had suggested a slightly different structure, a licensing arrangement rather than a straight sale, with an upfront payment and ongoing royalties. MoveStream had counter-offered. There had been 2 more rounds of negotiation. By the time Alex sat in that glass boardroom and signed the divorce papers with Whitfield's cheap ballpoint pen, the deal with MoveStream was 48 hours from closing. The number was not small. The review hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the family courthouse on Smythe Street, a utilitarian building that smells like institutional carpet and anxiety. Sandra arrived with Whitfield and 2 junior associates. She was dressed carefully. She looked the way she always looked in professional settings, composed, credible, exactly the right amount of formal. Alec arrived 15 minutes early. He came alone to the front steps, which was how it looked from the outside. In fact, he was not alone in the practical sense. There was a car behind him, a black town car that had pulled up to the curb, and behind that a second car. And the people getting out of those cars were 3 lawyers from a firm called Caldwell Marchetti, which was the kind of firm that did not have a new Westminster strip mall office, but instead had an entire floor of a building on West Georgia and a reputation that made Whitfield, when he saw them coming up the steps, visibly recalibrate. But that wasn't what people were looking at. What people were looking at was the car that had pulled up to the curb just before the town car. It was yellow. It was low to the ground. It was a Lamborghini Huracan, and it sat in front of the family courthouse on Smythe Street like a fact that refused to be ignored. Alec had driven it from the dealership himself. He'd picked it up the day before, which was the day the MoveStream deal closed, which was the day the money landed. And he'd done it not to be flashy, which was not in his nature, but because he had made a decision a long time ago about what the first physical proof of this would look like. And this was it. He was wearing a suit he'd had made, dark navy, nothing theatrical. And he was wearing his regular watch, not a new one, because there were some things about himself he wasn't interested in changing. He walked up the courthouse steps. Sandra was standing at the top. She saw him. She saw the lawyers. She saw the car at the curb. Her face did something complicated. Not just surprise, but something that was maybe the first moment she'd understood that she had made a calculation error, and that the error was significant. Whitfield leaned close to her and said something. She nodded but didn't take her eyes off Alec. Alec stopped in front of them. He looked at Sandra, not with triumph, because that wasn't the feeling or not the main one, and he said, simply, "Morning." Then he went inside. What happened in the courtroom itself took most of the morning. The Caldwell-Marchetti team had prepared thoroughly. They submitted documentation, the MoveStream licensing agreement, the payment records, the accountant's detailed records, showing that the software had been developed entirely premarital and postmarital, using Alec's sole resources with no commingling of marital assets. They submitted Adichie's evaluation report, which, it turned out, had concluded that Alec showed strong, consistent parenting instincts, emotional stability, and a clearly child-centered approach to decision-making. They submitted testimony from Cade's kindergarten teacher, from his former daycare supervisor, from a neighbor who had been present at the apartment regularly during Alec's custody weeks. They submitted a record of every school pickup, every doctor's appointment, every sick day where Alec had been the parent who came, the judge. A methodical woman named the Honorable Justice Bertrand reviewed all of it with the thoroughness of someone who had spent a career watching people try to paper over what was actually true. Whitfield attempted to argue that the MoveStream deal represented a material change in circumstances that required a new assessment of the original divorce terms, that Sandra should have an equitable claim to some portion of the proceeds, as the software had been developed during the marriage. The Caldwell-Marchetti response to this was 12 pages long and had been prepared by someone who had clearly anticipated exactly this argument. The documentation was airtight. The software was Alec's. The deal was Alec's. The marriage had ended. The math was simple. Justice Bertrand listened to both sides. She asked several pointed questions of Whitfield, who answered them in the way people answer questions when the answers are not going their way. She reviewed Dr. Adichie's report again. She looked at the parenting records for a long time. Then she issued her interim decision. Primary custody to Alec, Sandra to have access on a schedule to be agreed upon. A full review of the original divorce settlement terms to be conducted in light of the new financial circumstances. She said one other thing which was not in the record, but which Alec remembered afterward. She looked at him over her glasses and she said, "Mr. Dorsey, the court notes that you were the primary caregiver throughout the marriage and during the separation period. That consistency speaks for itself." Sandra caught up with him in the hallway outside the courtroom while the lawyers were still gathering papers. She looked different without the composure, not diminished exactly, but more like herself. Alec had always felt, somewhere underneath everything, that the real Sandra was someone he'd glimpsed occasionally and never quite reached. "I didn't know," she said, "about the software. I know you didn't. You could have told me." He thought about that. "I could have, but you'd filed for divorce, Sandra, and I needed to make sure Cade was taken care of. That was the only thing I was thinking about." She was quiet for a moment. A junior associate walked past them and pretended not to be listening. "Is he going to be okay?" she finally asked. "With all of this, with the change." "He's going to be fine," Alex said. "I've been telling him the truth all along. He knows I'm not going anywhere." She nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else, and then she didn't. She turned and walked back toward where Whitfield was standing. The first night Cade came to stay, not for a weekend, but to actually live, with his clothes in the closet and his sneakers at the door. Alec made spaghetti because that was the thing Cade requested. Not anything fancy. Spaghetti from a jar of sauce and ground beef, with garlic bread from the freezer. They sat at the kitchen table and ate, and Cade had sauce on his chin and didn't notice, and Alec didn't say anything about it, because it seemed like the kind of thing that didn't need fixing right this second. After dinner, they went up to the roof of the apartment building, because there was a rooftop patio that nobody used much. It was late September, and the air had that particular Vancouver early autumn quality. Cool enough to feel clean, still warm enough to sit outside. They could see the lights of the city and the dark shape of the mountains behind it, and a few stars working their way through the cloud cover. Cade sat beside him on the bench and leaned against his arm. He was 6 years old now. He smelled like tomato sauce and shampoo. "Dad," he said. "Yeah, is this our place now?" Alec looked around the rooftop. At the potted plants someone had left up here, overgrown and leggy. At the string of lights someone had strung along one side that still worked. At the mountains and the city and the few stars. "We're going to get a bigger place soon," Alec said. "Something with a backyard, maybe. We can get a dog." "A dog?" Cade sat up. This was very important news. "If you want one." Cade thought about this with the seriousness of someone making a major decision. "I want a big one," he said. "Not a little one." "Noted." The boy leaned back against his arm again, apparently satisfied. They sat there for a while without saying anything. Below them, the city moved in its usual way. Cars, lights, the distant sound of something. Above them, another star appeared through a gap in the clouds. "Dad? Yeah. Are you happy?" Alec looked at his son, at the small, serious face, at the sauce still on his chin, at the eyes that had Sandra's shape, but something else's, something that had arrived on its own, in the expression. "Yeah," he said, "I really am." Cade seemed to find this acceptable. He settled back in. After a while, he fell asleep with his head against Alec's arm. And Alec sat there in the autumn air above the city with his sleeping kid and thought about nothing in particular, which is the closest thing to peace he'd felt in a very long time. He didn't move until Cade was ready to wake up on his own.